In this last section of this long contribution towards the Scottish independence referendum debate, I want to really just comment from a Canadian perspective and a Commonwealth perspective on this issue. Living and being born in Canada, I've met many Canadian Scots and lived in Calgary, which is named after a little village on the Isle of Mull, and lived with Canadian Scots and came to respect and love the culture very much. And in Nova Scotia and throughout Canada, the Scots have played a huge role in founding the country and playing a crucial role culturally. There are great cultural ties between Scotland and Canada still, and also between Canada and the rest of the UK. There are large communities of Northern Irish people, Welsh, English, and so on. I think living in Canada is a real eye-opener. The size of the country, the hugeness, and also the optimism of the people, and the compassion of the people, and the commitment to international peacemaking efforts, and a rational world order. It was in Canada I became involved with the Quaker movement, with the Christian church, and it was in Canada that I became interested in world federalism and rational attempts to bolster the work of the UN and create some kind of international legal mechanisms that would remove international violence and conflict as the first port of call when you have differences with another nation. I think the model of Canadian federalism is a good one to pursue, and in a sense world federalism is a kind of Canada writ large. Why can't the countries of the world, just as Alberta and Quebec and Nova Scotia and British Columbia and so on, they all have their differences, they have their unique cultures, but they've agreed to come together in a federation with the capital at Ottawa to talk through politically those differences. And First Nation peoples in Canada likewise have now much more clout than previously, quite rightly so. And in fact, it was the First Nations elder, Dagan Awida, that has greatly inspired my work as a peace thinker and peace philosopher. And in the native cultures of Canada and North America, conflict was dealt with through the council fire. You called the council fire, you talked it through, you smoked in the four directions, you looked at every problem from the north, from the east, from the west and the south. You looked at things intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, and physically and practically. And then you came to a consensus, the tribe came to a consensus. I think the problem with Western culture in general and European culture is we have a paucity of political decision-making processes. And William Owen Thompson, one of the great scholars of metaphysics and politics, in his book From Nation to Emanation, in a sense says what we need is a transpersonal politics. We need people that care about the earth as a whole from all angles. We need, technically I suppose you might want to call them green thinkers, but the trouble with the green movement is it's been hijacked by people that have a rather narrow agenda and that seem to be simply proposing more and more regulation of people's ordinary activities and sticking out wind farms everywhere, and not actually taking account of holistic thinking at all, but rather imposing diktats from a centralised administration, such as, for instance, the charges in London for parking and the absurd war on motorists in London. I think what we need is seriously joined up visionary thinking, and from a native people's perspective in Canada, which again is a tradition I've have a lot of respect for and have written about, that looking at decisions from a holistic perspective, calling a council fire, I don't think has been done in the case of the destruction and break-up of the United Kingdom. I think it's too big a decision to just take in a narrow party political way and to have it forced on us by one particular nationalist agenda. If we sit down and share the council fire and think this through, I think as I've tried to say in this contribution, that we need much, much deeper thought about it. And, it's such a major decision that simply trusting politicians who are pushing it through for their own ego purposes and their own sense of victory, I think is undemocratic in the deepest sense of the word. And I feel, as a Canadian British person, that the Canadian model of a federation that keeps together in spite of its differences is a good model for the UK. I've actually argued that the House of Lords should be reformed, and it should be a non-party house. It shouldn't. I mean, we have too many political parties in this country. You shouldn't sit in the House of Lords as anything, a Liberal, a Conservative, a Labour, anything. You should be there because of your eminence as a citizen, because of your contributions to culture, the arts, industry, science, interfaith relations, whatever, peace. And I think that there should be equal representatives from the four parts of the United Kingdom: Northern Ireland, England, Scotland and Wales. And that body should discuss and debate matters that pertain to the entire country. That body of the great and the good. And it should have it should fully represent all the parts and areas and interests of people living throughout the United Kingdom. It should have more power than the current House of Lords, because it would become a kind of Senate, effectively. I think it should be able to initiate legislation. I think the Commons should probably simply become a debating chamber for English MPs. And we can move in the direction of having more power returned to the Parliaments of Edinburgh, Belfast and Stormont and Cardiff, and then the upper house, the Senate or the House of Lords, I don't care, it could still be called that, would then represent the United Kingdom as a whole in a federal sense. And then that constitutional change would be voted on by the citizens of the whole country as a package. And I think a debate should be held about this, to the advantage of all the citizens of the UK. But what I'm saying in this current referendum is it's too early to just think that breaking up the UK is the solution, and for one country to unilaterally leave it is going to cause endless chaos and confusion and a polarisation of attitudes and an increasing nationalism and endless triumphs for lawyers and accountants and the kind of people that like making lists and charging people vast sums of money for it. I want this country to get on with generating new ideas in industry, in social innovation, in peacemaking, and to actualise the goodness that is within us all. As I've said, politically, to actualise virtue in the sense of virtue ethics that Aristotle proposed. That's our duty, I think, our moral duty as a country. And I noticed today, as I'm working on this, Baroness Wolsey has resigned from the Foreign Office over Britain's silence over the mistreatment of Gaza by the Israeli Defence Forces and the collateral damage of civilians. Why are we not helping to mediate this? Why are we not calling out? I mean, many people are demonstrating, but it should be that we have an intelligent foreign policy that proposes, and as I've said, I think Palestine should be invited to join the Commonwealth. It was a former mandate territory. Its people actually respected the British, on the whole, the British administrators who ran Palestine, and we should deliver the goods and welcome them into the fold of the Commonwealth and help them build their shattered state. And Canadians, I know, would support that 100%. Also, people from other Commonwealth countries, Australia, New Zealand, India, Pakistan, Malaysia. There are many Muslims living throughout all those countries, and Christians and Jews, all of whom have an interest in seeing peace in the Middle East. This would be a Commonwealth project, and here we are in 1914 commemorating the horrors of World War One, and it was by nursing Scottish Canadian soldiers who'd fought in World War One that I became essentially a peace thinker and a peace activist. What I heard from them and saw engraved on their souls, the horrors of the carnage of World War One and World War Two, because I nursed people from World War Two, made me dedicate my life to preventing World War Three, and that's really where I think the Commonwealth can play a role, and the United Kingdom, in association with its allies in the Commonwealth, could be a genuine force for peace, just as in emergency it's a force for victory. What Churchill did by marshalling the empire to generate victory, and it was Canadians and Australians and others who really kept, and Indians and so on, who kept the Nazis at bay eventually with the support of the Americans. But the Americans came in very late, and as usual only when they thought it was in their advantage. And as a Canadian, I have some sceptical approach to the real politic of the United States of America. It was founded as a country on a policy of anti-American Indian encroachment on their lands. George Washington was a land dealer who wanted to break away from British rule because he wanted to seize American Indian lands for the aggrandizement of him and his class of people. And therefore they actually betrayed the treaties that the British had made with the native tribes, which is why most American Indians supported the British in the wars of independence. But that's another story, and you can consult my work as a historian about that. The point I'm making is that the Commonwealth is not a spent force. We have a duty to keep together and see this through. And on behalf of the Canadian Scottish troops that I nursed, and whose bodies I put into body bags in Calgary Hospital, I couldn't, in a clear conscience, commit myself to breaking up the United Kingdom before the job is seen through, and before we have left not chaos and mayhem and falling buildings in Gaza and Palestine, but actually two states living in peace side by side, the state of Israel and the state of Palestine. That's the very least we owe the people who died in World War One and Two, to defeat intolerance and demagoguery and violence. Until we've pulled off that peace, the mission is not yet accomplished, and I don't think we shut up shop and walk away from an unfinished project. And that leads me to my main point here, really. The synthesis of what I'm trying to say is that I think Britain has helped develop the Enlightenment project in world affairs. And if you study the Enlightenment in history from the 1600s on, really, people talk about an early Enlightenment in the 1600s. As a historian of ideas, I've worked in great detail at the University of London in early modern history and looking at the work of early philosophers, Descartes, Bacon, Leibniz in the 1600s, and then in the 1700s. And that union of the parliaments of England, Scotland and Wales was an incredible fillip to the advancement of enlightened ideas, and Britain, including all of its parts, Scotland, England, Wales, Ireland, because at that time Ireland as a whole was part of the United Kingdom, became really a model for countries and people elsewhere in Europe and the world who really admired our ability to have a constitutional settlement that was true to the Aristotelian vision of the best of all worlds. We kept a monarchy, but it was a constitutional monarchy. It was answerable ultimately to the people. We kept democracy as a functioning parliament, and we also had an aristocratic element in our governance and in our society. And I think that moderation, that tolerance, that, if you want, rainbow project was a hallmark of enlightened thinking. Other countries tried to model their constitutional reforms on that, and where they succeeded, they've strongly held and taken form. And We see that in the constitutions of countries like Canada and Australia and New Zealand and India, which has modelled itself largely on that model, and other countries around the world where they've not succeeded. I mean, I think sadly what happened in France, the French went to an excess, and by getting rid of the stabilising symbolism of the monarchy, and by executing and having a violent, bloody revolution, and also by destroying the aristocracy through the guillotine and the Reign of Terror, it created this instability. It's like then a body politic that tries to hop about on one leg, which is basically populism and mob democracy, and rather than actually walking about with four limbs. So I think, the UK is a very interesting experiment in history, and very much neglected by academics, actually. There's no Centre for UK Studies. Very few people study the constitutional settlements and the evolution of Great Britain into the United Kingdom. When I've been teaching citizenship, as I've done in British schools, and it's a fascinating subject to teach, it's rare to find people that are really students and pupils that are really intelligently able to discuss the distinctions between Britishness, Englishness, the UK, the complex relationship between the different parts of this country. Norman Davies has written a wonderful book about the Isles, which goes into the history of all the islands of Britain, and I think that's the sort of thing historians can be doing to to help people make sense of this complex decision that we're all being faced with in Scotland. I met recently someone doing a PhD on early tourism in Scotland from England, going back as far as the 1600s. There was a tradition of people coming north of the border and travelling about and keeping diaries. A number of women, particularly Quakers and so on, in the 1700s, early 1700s, kept their diaries. Not just Dr. Johnson, who kept, of course, the most famous of such diaries. And this woman, who was, in fact, Canadian, did a PhD at a Scottish university on this. And, that's an interesting facet, that by travelling about in all the different parts of the UK, I mean, if you look at the history of geology and how science developed, if you look at the work of James Hutton and the great pioneering Scottish geologists, you'll see that ideas have always flown back and forth across all the parts of the United Kingdom. In my cultural encyclopedia of the Welsh Marches, I discovered the incredible cross-fertilisation between Welsh thinkers and English thinkers. And long may that flourish, long may that go on. I mean, it happened in all fields of knowledge, from science to the humanities to theology. And just recently we've had an Archbishop of Canterbury who was Welsh, Rowan Williams, and who contributed, a lot of his own spiritual heritage, including his love of poetry and so on. One of the proposals I put forward as a poet for peace is that every cathedral in Britain should have a poet in residence, or a poet or a bard in residence. So why can't the cathedrals of all of Scotland, England, Wales and Ireland have a poet in residence whose duty would be to read a few poems every couple of months, maybe take part in a service or two, and maybe run workshops for school kids that could come in, and he could read, or she could read poetry, their own and others, encourage the kids to read poetry, and to study some of the great Christian poetic classics. After all, it was Caedmon, the great Anglo-Saxon bard of Northumbria, who was the first Christian poet in the Anglo-Saxon world, and of course in the Druid and Celtic sphere of Ireland and Scotland and Wales, we have these huge riches of people like Taliesin and Amergin and so on, going right back in time to the old poetic and bardic craft. So why can't in all the cathedrals of Britain we have a poet in residence? I think that would create a more peaceful aesthetic. And anyway, Rowan Williams was in favour of this, but he pointed out this is not really within his call as Archbishop of Canterbury. It's up to the dean or bishop of each cathedral. So if you think of people like T.S. Eliot and R.S. Thomas and all the great poets of contemporary Britain. Let's make this country a more poetical place. I don't want to see it taken over by accountants and politicians and petty bureaucrats who are going to carve it up in their own interest and just pocket their legal fees on the way to the bank laughing. I'd much prefer we turn this into a poetic republic in which the poets become the legislators of people's consciences and spiritual natures. I think this is the trouble with our country. We run the risk of losing our souls, and as Christ pointed out a very long time ago, that's not a good way to go. It seems to me nationalism is a false substitute for enlightenment and true moral and spiritual intelligence, and it's premised on a kind of false argument that our tribe is by definition better than yours. And this is precisely what Christ was preaching against, and what all philosophers and sages worth their salt have I think ever since the beginning of time been preaching against. It's what Pythagoras founded philosophy about, because he was himself half Phoenician and half Greek. He stood as a living reconciliation between Semitic traditions and Indo-European Greek Hellenistic traditions. And his magical number system, the arche of arithmoi, the numbers, was pan-tribal. You can be a philosopher, whatever your colour, race, creed, language. And I think the United Kingdom at its best is a place, a venue, in which we can fully cultivate that universal humanity. And for us to reduce it down to just another nationalist project, I think, is as I say, is something that would be to sell ourselves short. And so finally, it's almost an aesthetic argument that I have. I think the true beauty of Britain, the true beauty of the people here, and I'm speaking as someone who's lived outside of Britain and travelled very widely, when I come back, I see it, is this diversity. The incredible diversity of the landscape. It's such a small little series of islands, and yet, the rolling hills of Sussex, or the coasts of Dorset, or the islands of Argyll, or the mountains of the Cairngorms and so on, or the landscapes of Northern Ireland, each one of them is uniquely different and incredible. It's like an ancient goddess and god in the landscape. And as a Druid, this is how we feel. We feel Gaia as a living being, and it's evolved over these millennia into these incredible shapes and contours, and belongs together as one being, in a sense. And all the people, all us children who've grown up here and share this amazing landscape, I think we need to learn to live in peace together. We need to actualise our creative genius, and we need to help the rest of the world that's struggling with whatever we can, with intellectual help, constitution building, legal help, so that we can prevent these wars going on in Ukraine, in Syria, in Libya, in Israel, Palestine, and so on, and then enjoy the fruits of a peaceful world together, and realise the ideals for which the United Nations was founded when our country finally defeated Hitlerism and fascism and saw off that totalitarian nationalist threat. What we dreamed of, what my parents' generation dreamed of, and they met in the Blitz in London during the war, was a world of peace, tolerance, intellectual excitement, discovery, science, mutual intercourse, and appreciating the arts, and Picasso and people like this were their heroes. And I think we should get back on track to build a beautiful world together. The Scottish people, the Welsh, the Irish, the English, we all have these tremendous traditions. We can contribute to that. But none of us have a monopoly of that. We share a country together, the United Kingdom. Let's celebrate it in all its complexity, including all the incredible beauty and wonder of recent immigrant communities that have come here. And since we're a kind of microcosm of the whole planet, we can then help, in a sense, bring peace to that planet. And this is where I think the Commonwealth comes in. We can work through the United Nations. We can try and work with the European Union as well, which is another internationalist project for peace. And let's stick together and complete that mission. And anyway, thank you for listening, and I hope these thoughts have been helpful. And I look forward to hearing any feedback or comments. But let's try and conduct this debate in a rational and loving manner. Thank you so much.